In this week's parsha, we have two psukim that speak all about emunah, our belief and the knowledge, ki Hashem hu elikim, that Hashem is the one and only. So we have one pasuk, the famous pasuk, Ata hareisa ladas ki Hashem hu elikim v'nei mulvado. You were shown by Matan Torah, the Yidden saw that Hashem is the absolute only one. There is no one besides Him. Another pasuk tells us, v'yadaito hayoim v'ashevois alavecha. You should know today and take it to heart. Ki Hashem hu elikim, that Hashem is the God, b'shamayim imav alaretz mitochas, in the heavens above and the earth below. Einoi, there's no one else. The Rebbe says simply the difference between these two psukim are, in the first pasuk where it doesn't specify heavens and earth, etc., is speaking about the way the Yidden saw Hashem at Matan Torah, meaning it was a revelation from above to below. And as far as Hashem's revelation, when they see the oneness of Hashem as it is, in truth, there is no difference between heavens and earth in regards to Hashem. And therefore, the pasuk doesn't specify heaven and earth. Whereas in the pasuk where it says, when it's a command to the person, you should think about it, you should know it, you should put effort into understanding that Hashem is the only one. So as far as the person's understanding is concerned, the person's perspective, there is going to be differences in the details of Hashemayim Imal, how it's understood the way Hashem is the one and only in the heavens above, and how he understands it down on the earth below, etc. The Rebbe says we see this clearly in a medrash that says that Yisroi gave some credit to the Avodah Zorah. And he says, Atu Yadati, I know that Hashem is greater, Mikol Elikim. That sounds like he's giving some credit to these other Avodah Zorahs and saying Hashem is greater than them. Naaman, who was a general in Aram, who comes to Elisha because he had tzaras, etc., he finally says, now I know, Ki ein Elikim b'chol haaretz, there's no God in the whole earth besides by Yisrael. Which means he's testifying about Hashem being on earth, but not about the heavens. Rachav, the woman who allowed the spies to stay in her house when they were coming to check out Eretz Yisrael, she says that everyone knows Ki Hashem Elikeichem Hu Elikim, that Hashem is the God, Bashamayim Imav La'aretz Mitachas, on the heavens above and the earth below. But nevertheless, she still missed something out. B'chalol Shalom. What about the rest of the empty space, so to speak, of the world, of the earth? Or Chalol Shalom, later the Rebbe says this could be referring to the Klipos. In other words, in places where there's a void, there's an emptiness. What about there? Comes along Moshe Rabbeinu and he says, Hashem hu elikim b'shamayim imal, Hashem is the Eibishter in the heavens above, vala aretz mitochas, in the earth below. Ein oid, what does ein oid mean? Even b'chalol shalolam, even in any of the other hollow, empty space or the world of Klipos. In other words, here we see the same idea that when the person is thinking about Hashem being the one and only, there's a difference, how we understand it, what it means, b'shamayim imal, in the heavens above, etc., etc. However, the Rebbe asks, from the fact that the Torah divides this mitzvah v'yadaita of knowledge of Hashem into three different stages or three different levels, that tells us that it's not only coming to tell the person that you should not make a mistake, to think that there's going to be a difference the way Hashem is up in the heavens and that Hashem is down here on earth. But rather, Torah's emes is telling us that in fact there is some sort of chiddush, there's some sort of novelty in saying that Hashem is not only in the heavens but also on the earth and even in the empty space, so to speak. So we need to understand what is the chiddush. Obviously, Hashem is the one and only, then Hashem is the one and only all over. In fact, says the Rebbe, the Alter Rebbe asks a very similar question. In Shara Yichud Ve'amunah, the Alter Rebbe says, are you going to think that there's some sort of God hiding there under the earth, under the ocean? So why does the pasuk say, B'shamayim imav v'la'aretz mitachas, etc.? So the Rebbe says, the Alter Rebbe explains, that what the pasuk is coming to tell us, not that there's no other God besides Hashem, but rather there's no other existence besides for Hashem at all, because everything is completely nullified, everything is batel b'metzius. And therefore we can understand why the pasuk says Vala Aretz Mitachas, because it's one thing to speak about the spiritual heavens, to say that everything is completely batel to Hashem, everything is nullified to Hashem. But when we speak about the physical, materialistic earth that seems so real to us, so much of a substance to us, to come along and say that here Hashem is also the only one and nothing else exists, we understand that this is another chiddush. But the problem, says the Rebbe, the question is, if we were speaking just about how the person feels about it, we can understand that in our own feeling, the world seems much more real to us, down to earth seems much more real to us, so we need to be told that even though the world seems like a Metzius, we should recognize that it's still really completely nullified to Hashem. But that's as far as the feelings of the person. But the pasuk says v'yodaita, that even in the logical understanding, in the understanding of it, there seems to be a difference between on the heavens above and the earth below. And the question then is, as far as the logic goes, seemingly they're exactly both the same bottle to Hashem. They're completely nullified to Hashem, and Hashem is the only existence. Because what's the proof that the Alter Rebbe gives that Hashem is the only reality? Because everything needs Hashem to constantly be creating it every single second. Well, that same logic holds true both for the spiritual worlds and the heavens, as well as the earth down below. So again, we need to understand, why does the pasuk need to emphasize and specify that Hashem is the one and only, not only in the heavens above, but also on the earth below? The Rebbe says another proof to see this idea that there's some difference between the heavens above and the earth below is the fact that when the Alter Rebbe is speaking about this idea that Hashem is constantly creating everything, he brings in the name of the Baal Shem Tov, the pasuk L'olam Hashem dvarcha nitzav b'shamayim, that forever Hashem, your words are standing in the heavens to create them. The words that Hashem said Yehi Rakeh are always in the heavens. Then the Alter Rebbe goes on and says, and the same thing is true with all other creations besides the heavens, as all the different things of the Asara Ma'amoris that Hashem said in the 10 utterances are always within the creation to keep them in existence. Then the Alter Rebbe says, and not only the things that are in the Asara Ma'amoris, but even everything else that is not mentioned there, because the words of the Asara Ma'amoris come down many, many more levels until they finally reach into every single object on earth. So what do we see here? That even though it's true Hashem's words are in everything, and yet what does the pasuk say? Which pasuk is this all learned out from? L'olam Hashem dvarcha nitzav b'shamayim. It sounds like it's mainly in the heavens, but then it's also all over everywhere else as well. So we need to understand what in fact is the real difference between the heavens above and the earth below, etc. Says the Rebbe, the explanation is, the chidush of the Baal Shem Tov, that Hashem is the absolute only reality and everything is bottled b'metzias because Hashem is creating everything all the time, is not only that Hashem is creating it, in other words, that Hashem is the power behind it, but then the world becomes an entity for itself. In other words, it's a separate entity, but Hashem is the one giving it the ability to exist. But rather, that Hashem's words are clothed, are inside, are integrated, are becoming one with every single creature in its own individual characteristics. In other words, the very character of each and every object contains the words of Hashem in its way as it is down here. In other words, it's not a separate thing that you have godliness and you have the object, which are two separate things, or one, and Hashem is creating the Gashmizik thing. Rather, each and every thing contains inside of it those words of Hashem that are constantly creating it. And that's why it's really bottled completely. In other words, even with its details, it's completely one with Hashem and not a separate existence. And the Rebbe explained, based on this we can understand why one could say, logically, why one would think that it makes more sense to say Hashem Olikim B'Shamayim Mimal, and why you have to say no, even Al Haaretz Mitachas. Because if we're speaking about the way Hashem clothes himself inside different things, so we might be able to think in the heavenly bodies, in the heavenly things, which are obviously much more a keli, much more of a receptacle, much more a container to be able, a vehicle to be able to contain these higher levels of godliness. So there, the words of Hashem are really clothed inside of them, becoming integrated with it, and therefore they are completely bottled to Hashem. In other words, their whole existence is only godliness. Whereas Al Haaretz Mitachas, in the earth down below, which is not really a keli to godliness, so then you might, and yes, it's being created by Hashem the whole time, but perhaps it's not that same level of bittul to the word of Hashem, because at the end of the day, the word of Hashem didn't become one with it. So this is why we have to say, no, even Al Haaretz Mitachas, the words of Hashem are coming in there. And then there's even a greater chiddush, even the things that are not mentioned in the Asara Ma'amoris. Rather, they're coming down further and further levels. Even here we say that here too, the word of Hashem is coming down and becoming united with that individual creature, and therefore it too is completely one with Hashem, and therefore Einoi, there's nothing else, neither B'Shamayim Mimal or B'Al Haaretz Mitachas, and so too, even in Chalolei Shalom, even so to speak, in these areas where the words of our Torah are not even there, the words of Asarim HaMamoros are not there, these other things, which as the Rebbe explains in the footnote, could be referring to Klippa, really even there's nothing besides for Hashem. The Rebbe now takes this and applies it practically to our Avodas Hashem, because we know that that's the bottom line, Hamaisu Ikar. So says the Rebbe, these three stages of that we should recognize that Hashem is Bashamayim Imal, the heavens above, Vala Oretz Mitachas, on the earth below, and even in all of these seemingly negative things, which by the way says the Rebbe fits also with the three stages that the Alter Rebbe said. There's Loilam Hashem Dvorcha Nitzu Bashamayim, the words of Hashem in the heavens. There's then the things that are in all other creatures that are taken from the Asarim HaMamoros, and finally from those things that are not even mentioned in the Asarim HaMamoros. So the Rebbe applies this to the avoid of every day. The Rebbe says in order for a person's avoid to be properly, first, the person needs the preparation. He goes to sleep at night to be able to serve Hashem better the following day. At that point, the neshama goes up above to receive new chayas from Hashem. So, and as soon as he wakes up, he says, Moida ani lefanecha, he's completely acknowledging Hashem, giving himself over to Hashem. In other words, this is the time that he feels his neshama was just refreshed and coming from its root, Bashamayim. Now starts a Seder Avodah of the next two stages. And that is, the Yid now needs to impact his guf as well, his body. And that's going to be when he davens and he gets involved in the spiritual avodah of his day. So now even the eretz, his guf, his body is also going to be permeated with kedusha, ala oretz mitochas. But then he's still involved in some way, he's still davening and learning, getting himself involved in the world of kedusha. But then comes the next stage, which is b'chalolei shalolim, even so to speak, in that empty space, or the space which is more to do with the gashmis of the world, even in a lower way, which this is when he gets involved in his work, in his business, etc., etc. And here too, he recognizes Hashem. So when the Yid does his avodah b'shamayim imav ala oretz mitochas, he has the ability. In other words, he starts off with his moedani, he has his davening, etc. Then he has the ability, even in his mundane things, to bring in godliness to the whole gashmis to the world completely. Is not taking up any space. Rather, he reveals even there that Einoi, there's nothing besides for Hashem.